So, when I was talking to one of my friends about this review, they made the suggestion that I should do about a 4 second review of Half-Life. Okay, it was going to be something like this. Attention, Internet. Half-Life? Good. Fire, bad! And then I'd cut it off right there. And, I was actually sincerely tempted because it's Half-Life, right? But there were a few things I wanted to discuss with regards to video gaming in general, and Half-Life seemed like a good game to use as a model for this sort of thing. I'm not going to go into any of the more obvious things. Let's be frank here. Half-Life is a game that has been analyzed and reanalyzed more than a few times. In fact, ironically, Zero Punctuation did a review of Half-Life not that far ago, not that long ago, very recently, which is funny because I was actually in my queue before he did his, so I still get credit for being first. But anyways, for anyone who's wondering why I'm reviewing Half-Life, that is because every game that I'm reviewing up until a certain period, I believe Morrowind was the last on the list. I don't know. I have the list written down. I don't have it with me, obviously. Anyways, every game that I'm reviewing is one that has been requested, and I had a vote some time ago. Which game would you like to see most? And I'm doing them in order of which games had the most votes. That's why I've been doing things in this order. That's why I did the entire Final Fantasy series before I moved on. Now, Half-Life is one of those games that is almost intriguing to talk about when you really get down to it, because there are only a handful of games. Well, okay, the opinions vary, but in my opinion, there are only a handful of games that you could really point to a specific game and say that changed the industry. Not, I shouldn't say the industry because that's getting the wrong point. That changed gaming. That changed video gaming. That made the entire market, the entire creative outlet different. Now, yes, of course, video games by their nature are something that is made by a company that is trying to make money. That is something that always must be kept in mind when it comes to video games. But it is also worth noting that that does not preclude the possibility of video games having a creative impact, being works of art, and not my definition of art, just general works of art. Now, yes, you can define everything as art, and we've talked about this before. My point is, just because things are being designed from the base point of making money does not mean there was not passion or interest or intellect or design that was put into them. Now, by sheer happenstance, I got into Half-Life when it came out, even though I knew virtually nothing about it. That's why I say it was happenstance. A friend of mine loaned me one of his CDs that had another game on it, and I can't remember what was on it actually, or whether what it was supposed to be, because he had the wrong CD in the case. It was Half-Life. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what's this? And he says, oh, it's some game I picked up. I haven't actually played through it yet. You can go ahead and play through that instead. We'll swap later. And I was like, okay. So I ended up playing Half-Life within a few days of it coming out without really meaning to. So my point is I had no knowledge of the hype or anything that was going into it. It was just, okay, here's this game. So with absolutely no expectations, I admittedly was completely blown away. One of the reasons for that, and one of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, why I still hold Half-Life up as one of the greatest games ever made, and in the art category, in my opinion, is the fact that it was first-person storytelling done properly, which is something that it is debatable has happened prior to Half-Life, but in my opinion was first done properly in Half-Life. Let me explain what I mean a bit. There's a difference between having a story that is done from a first-person perspective and having a first-person story, one that explicitly uses that first-person perspective as a tool, as a literary tool, as a creative tool, in order to enhance and engage the story, okay? There's actually a very small number of games, in my opinion, that actually do the first-person story, like Half-Life did. Now, let me diverge for just a second. I'll get back to this in a moment. I mentioned in my Final Fantasy XII review what a story was, and I was going to elaborate on it here. When I say the word story, it's a term I've basically come up with, or obviously I didn't invent the word, but it's the term I use in order to describe this block of things that I find engaging about a game. So I can have a category that says I like the story first in a game. That's the first thing I look to. Because I don't look to the plot first, which is a part of a story. I don't look to the subplots, which is part of the story. There's also setting, there's character history, there's character history, characterization, and character growth. And then there's the richness of the presentation, how dynamic it is, how living it feels, right? These five elements are what I define as the story of a game. Now, looking at Half-Life objectively speaking, while it has a great story when we look at the overall category, when we break these down, to be honest, Half-Life is lacking in a few places. The atmosphere, for example, and that's another thing. I'm sorry, I meant to redefine this. This isn't just how living it feels. I talked about this before with, like, say, for example, Final Fantasy 12 and Final Fantasy 9 are both excellent examples. Skyrim pulls this off several times. This isn't just about how alive the world feels, but also about the atmosphere, what kind of emotions it invokes simply by being there. Uh, if I was to be honest with myself, I would say the most atmospheric game I've ever played, the game that does this the absolute best, would be Super Metroid, a game that has virtually no dialogue and yet nonetheless manages to be very engaging and very emotional if you're looking at it in the right way. And I don't mean to say that there's a wrong way to look at it. I'm just saying that when I play that game, it's like, oh my god, you know. So Half-Life does this extremely well. There is a great amount, a fantastic amount of brutal, creepy, terrifying, still, hesitant, tense atmosphere throughout the whole game, and it is very well done, and it is very well presented. Um, Characterization. This is one I'm going to give a half point, okay? And for two reasons. I'll get to the first person reason in a second, so let's just leave that aside for when I get back to the first person discussion. But all the NPCs you encounter usually only have a few lines of dialogue. Now, whether this is up to the writers or the voice actors they got involved is debatable. But it is my opinion that even though you only have a few lines from these people, you see the outlines of a character there, if you follow my saying. You know, obviously, you don't know the full depth and breadth of these people with a few lines, but you do get enough that you could see where their personalities and where they're coming from and their variants. And nowhere is this more apparent than with the G-Man, when you finally truly start encountering him right there at the end there. Very well done and so subtle. I've talked before about how I enjoy subtlety in anything, in video games, in books, and media, and this is no exception. Half-Life is a brilliantly subtle game, to the point where some things I admit myself I didn't even catch the first time through, or the second time through. Sometimes, you know, I've talked to other people, and I talked about, you know, blah, 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 that I really liked, and they're like, what? Because they didn't even catch that. You know, things like that. It is a brilliantly subtle game. It does, and one of the reasons I like things that are subtle, ignoring the fact that it encourages you to think, which is something I enjoy, obviously, it also doesn't sell you short. It doesn't try to present you as you're an idiot. It is like it's obviously it's artificial. It is by its definition artificial, and it may even be cynical in its nature. However, what it is doing very really is saying to you that I have a degree of respect for you. You know, that's what the game is basically saying when it does that level of subtlety. When it doesn't, you know, do this thing with the story and the plot. It's here in the background. It's over there in the distance. You have to look at it. It's saying, I respect you to some degree or another. I believe that you have enough of a brain to pick up on this stuff without me having to shove it in your face. I was talking about that with my Voyager reviews too, because they have the opposite problem. But anyways, moving on. So that's those 2 points across. As characterization, we have subplots. Okay, subplots in Half-Life, it's debatable if there are any, to be honest. I've heard this debated off and on. I would argue that overall you could argue that there are in fact multiple plots in Half-Life, but I will admit that it is such a fine definition that we're getting into semantics and it doesn't matter at that point. I can't really give them full credit for having subplots and individual plots within the story. So that's something that is lacking. The main plot. This is also debatable because the main plot of Half-Life, if you really write it out, is actually kind of threadbare and rather simple. It is nevertheless engaging because of everything else, because of the atmosphere, because of the setting, because of the presentation. But ultimately, the main plot taken out of all of those elements and put down on a piece of paper and written out, summarized, is not actually the most amazing plot I've ever read in my life. I will give them half credit because it is still very well constructed within the format, but only half credit on that one. And finally, the setting. The setting has to do with the history and the background of the world, and honestly, I can't even give them partial credit on this one because, well, see, even that I'm kind of torn on, because we get hints of what's actually going on, hints of what's going on with the border world, hints of why these aliens are attacking and why these aren't. There is so much hidden information there that is never stated outright, and in fact, we're still guessing on to this day, because Half-Life Episode 3 still hasn't come out. You know, and some things that we weren't even revealed on until Half-Life 2 that we were theorizing on all those years because it was so quiet. Beautiful example of this, okay? When you get to the borderland, you start going through the factory area, and some of the workers there who are of this alien species who you've been fighting this whole time aren't actually hostile unless you attack them. Now that's something that has to be done as a conscious choice. That's not something that can just, it can happen by accident, but in general, if you're coding something like that, you have to go out of your way to do so. They went out of their way to do so to get across part of the point. Now, obviously, you could go through there and just be like, yeah, they're workers and they're not fighting. Or you could go through there and get just the tiniest little hints of the fact that these people are unhappy, are subjugated, are oppressed, are being ruled, are in disagreement. You understand what I'm saying here? There's levels of subtlety there, and there's different ways you can interpret that, of course. And this was expounded on in Half-Life 2, like I mentioned. But the point is, I do have to give them credit for setting, ultimately, I know I don't, partially I don't want to, because so much of the game is about a real-life scenario where there is basically no background setting development at all, other than we're a secret development facility and we're doing these tests. Now, that was very well presented. The whole intro on the cart ride was awesome, don't mistake me. But I'm talking the fleshing out of a world here. But I will give them credit because of everything they fleshed out with regards to the invaders and the aliens and the experiments and all that stuff. I will definitely give them credit on that. So, what I'm getting at here is the fact that Half-Life, while it has some obvious flaws in this overall problem, in this overall setup here, when you put them together, it does have an excellent story, in my opinion. Now, I'm sorry for that huge divergence. Let's get back to the first person thing, okay? Like I mentioned, one of the things about characterization with regards to first person, one of the most important things to do for a first-person story, a story of this nature, is to go out of your way to not characterize your character. Obviously, you're on rails to a fairly large extent, actually. Call of Duty 4. The Modern Warfare is another excellent example of this, and while some people disagree with me on some of my other options, which I will not mention here because I don't want to get into that, I think most people agree both of those games are excellent examples of what I'm talking about. A first-person story. Yes, you're on rails. Yes, you have to do this. Yes, there's very little variation. However, they go out of their way to ensure that you are never vocalized, even though they could have. It would have been very easy to do so, actually. And they go out of their way to... I don't know how to explain this properly, so you'll forgive me. But one of the main points of a first-person story, one of the biggest, strongest selling points, is the fact that you, the player, can project whatever personality you want onto the individual you're playing, if you follow what I'm saying here. Hence, first-person perspective. You see where I'm going with this? I have known people who view Freeman as a lost, confused, desperate, just barely struggling to survive, almost crazed from the level of trauma he's been going through, mental and emotional trauma. I've heard people who present him as the cool and calm individual who is very scientific about things, while he's very unemotional. He's just approaching this all with the mentality of I need to solve the next problem, that kind of thing. I've heard people present him as the kind of emotionally unstable person, which is different from the first person, because the first personality I mentioned, because this person is, for example, they would have him shoot the scientist after they gave their little speech or whatever. And it wasn't because they were going after some cheap thrill or trying to be like, haha, that's funny. It was because they were portraying, and in their mindset, that Freeman was someone who was so psychotic from the incident that had happened and from the accident and from everything that happens afterward, which, let's be honest, is kind of the sort of mind-breaking stuff that would occur in a real-life person, that he just kind of flipped. And so, for example, when the troops arrive, when the military shows up, his first response is to just start shooting. No questions, no anything, just, hey, because there's a thing there, if you understand my meaning here. And I've heard people do kind of combinations of these, over the course of the game. He molds in personality. My point, I've only mentioned like 4 here. And I've heard dozens. I've heard dozens of different things, and that's the point. Every single person, every single player can project as much or as little of personality upon this character as they want to. I've heard some people who don't even think about that, who don't have a personality there. It's just a gun that happens to be hovering over the ground that is going around doing the game. And that's fine. You can do that too. That's the point. That's the power of a truly well-done first-person story like this, is you can project as much or as little to any degree or extent, varying or otherwise, whatever personality onto the main character you can. So I give this ties into my earlier point about characterization. I give them full points for characterization on that, based on the fact that that was a clear and decisive design choice and worked out very well. This was also, in my opinion, like I said, the first time video game had really pulled this off. It really approached this medium, because first-person storytelling like this is only actually possible within a video game, in my opinion. I have heard arguments that it can be done in other formats. I disagree personally. I'm open for debate on the subject, but the point remains. It is my opinion, and I've debated this before, that you can only do this, and Half-Life was what started really pushing that sort of thing. And it is a shame that we've had so few other games since then that have really pulled off that sort of personality. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about Half-Life is pacing. Okay, Half-Life, in my opinion, had beautiful pacing. But this is something I've been tossing around a while. I've talked about pacing for many reviews and many games. I've never really sat down and discussed one of the problems with pacing, okay? The problem is pacing is dependent upon an individual opinion, okay? Whether or not you find a particular type of pacing as enjoyable as I do is dependent on whether or not you or I enjoy this. It's your opinion and my opinion, right? Not everyone is going to find the same kind of pacing proper. We may agree that it is correct from a construct and a literary perspective. We may both agree that Half-Life has excellent pacing, but whether or not we enjoy it depends on the individual. And that is one of the biggest problems because there is no such thing as perfect pacing. There is no such thing as pacing that everybody is going to enjoy. Now let me discuss this. You'll notice I have this little stylus thing from the 3DS, from Theater Rhythm, or however the heck you pronounce that. And I actually pulled it out on purpose because I wanted to kind of demonstrate this, okay? The best way I've come up with to describe pacing to someone who hasn't bothered looking into the term at all is pacing is about equaling out to zero, okay? Think about right here. This is basic neutrality. This is not calm. This is not fast-paced. This is not loud. This is not soft. This is right down the middle. It's just like Shades of Grey over on TNG. I'm sorry, that was mean. Um, the point is, this is the zero line, okay? Now, pacing, if you go up, you balance it out by going down. If you go down a little bit and then go up a bunch, you have to then pace it out by going down a little bit again, so that the overall net of making up numbers right off the top of my head, -1 plus 2, -1 equals out to 0. You see where I'm going with this? This is pacing, and there are several different ways to do this, but the general goal is to equal out to 0. At the end of the whole thing, everything balances each other out. You follow me? So Half-Life tends to do this beautiful sequence where I wish I had I'm going to do it like right there. In my eyes view, it's right there. Okay, that's the 0 line right there. So Half-Life starts down here, way down here, and it does this for quite a while, and then it spikes up, and then it goes back down to about the halfway point where we hit tension, where we hit suspense, and then it'll do this every now and again. Just kind of like that, right? And overall, it will start to, at about this point, and this is beautiful because they give this gap here. I know you can't actually see what I'm mentally picturing here, but it starts off here, does the big spike when the accident has, goes back down here, and there's a fairly large point where it doesn't actually climb in suspense other than the spikes. And the reason for that is they want to give the player, the viewer, a degree of time to process, assuming they want to. They don't have to, of course, but that is the whole point of having periods of chunks like that where it's like, okay, let's figure out what happened, And truly good games will do this sort of thing, and then it starts to ramp up. Then it starts to increase and increase and increase until it reaches the point where it goes above the line, and it starts to get up here, and then it'll be up here for quite a while. And you'll notice that, obviously, I'm kind of running out of room here in my own visual thing, but it stayed down here for a while, and then it'll stay up here for a while. Again, overall balancing itself out, and then it plummets again, and so forth and so on. I could literally go through the whole game like this, but I'm not going to do that and bore the heck out of you. My point is that the overall pacing of the game, in my opinion, was excellent and extremely enjoyable. It bothered to take into account the fact that you're not a machine, that you're a person, that you have emotions, that you have feelings, that every now and again a gamer is just going to sit there with their hands off the keyboard going, huh, you know? And Lord knows I was one of those people when the accident first happened. I mean, when I first went through that game and I was going through the intro area, I had no idea what to expect. I knew this was a first-person shooter because the entire presentation was that, and it was built on, I believe, the Quake 2 engine. I'm not 100% on that. So obviously this was going to be a shooter of some kind, but what the heck is this? And it reached the point where it was so quiet and so dull for so long that I actually let my guard down, which was the point. It's just all this mundane, normal stuff, and it's completely normal. There's nothing out of the ordinary at all other than, the suit and, all that fun stuff. Even that is portrayed in such a normal fashion that you get the impression that this is what you do every day, that this is your normal, everyday routine. And that's the point. And then it gets to the part where we're going to try the sample, and there's a few arguments about the sample, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, clearly, something's going to happen with this sample, and some aliens are going to pour through. That was kind of what I was thinking at the time. Never did I think that everything was going to go so completely to hell so fast. Again, there was that first spike I mentioned. Just, and they had this beautiful thing where they had the character going, And I love that because, again, that's that first person storytelling, because that could be someone who is shocked, that could be someone who's in pain, maybe that's what's happening, maybe that's someone who is surprised, maybe that's someone who is exhausted from the experience. We don't know. And we're never told because that's the point. I love that. But my point overall here is that Half-Life definitely, whoever designed the overall structure of the game, because that's what pacing comes down to. Pacing isn't really a writing thing so much as it is a directing thing. It is, okay, here, if we're looking at a timeline here, here is the whole story. And you have to look at things from a broad scale as you're going through on this line and balancing things out. And it was very clear that everything was very well balanced and very well modded in order to be this wonderful level of pacing. Now, I've gone enough about that, but I wanted to talk about that with regard to video gaming in general, because pacing is one of those things that is very important in all forms of media, in my opinion. And it deserves special recognition whenever a video game manages that, because, to be honest, not many do. I mean, statistics, percentage speaking. Obviously, I could name a couple dozen right off the top of my head that have excellent pacing. I'm not going to. But my point is that when you look at the percentage of overall video games, of all the games ever, most games do not have proper pacing. Even excellent games do not have proper pacing. If I may use an example right here, Mega Man 2, what I consider to be one of the greatest of the Mega Mans personally, has almost no pacing whatsoever. I mean, there is a degree of it there, but it's there, for all intents and purposes, it might as well not even exist because it wasn't deliberate. You understand what I mean? Still a great game. And then you have a game like Final Fantasy VI, which I consider to be actually the closest thing to perfect pacing I've ever seen, and is also an excellent game. So, the differences between the two are multifaceted and varied, and that's one of the reasons why I try not to discuss it in as much depth as I have here, because ultimately this is a very complex subject, and something that, as I said, depends on your personal perspective thereof. So if I tell you this game has excellent pacing, constructively speaking, you can look at that and say, yes, it does, but I hate it. And you're absolutely right for that. If that's your opinion, if that's your honest thought on the matter, it's like, well, yeah, but I wish it had been this instead. And I'd be like, okay, we can discuss this. So I just wanted to get that out again because we were talking about video games in general. A lot of things I'm talking about here ultimately have to do with video gaming rather than just Half-Life, and that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to go ahead with this review. Because Half-Life is an excellent way to cut a slice out of video game here and examine the layers, because you see so much of what video games are and can be within Half-Life. Can video games be art? Of course they can. Anyone who says otherwise is, I'm sorry, stupid. But can video games be an excellent form of art? Can video games be a true form of expression? In my opinion, yes. And again, Half-Life is a beautiful example of that. Can video games tell an engaging story without the main character ever speaking a word? Yes, of course they can. And that by itself is something that obviously other games have done to some extent or another. But Half-Life was one of the first ones to really try and tell a true in-depth story. Well, not in-depth, but a story that is more in-depth than other things we've seen, like, say, Mario Brothers. No offense to Mario Brothers. With having a protagonist that has no lines. Can a video game pull the viewer in such a way that they can feel the experiences, they can be emotionally impacted by the game? Yes, of course. And obviously games before Half-Life have done this, but again, it's a nice cross-section. I could keep going. There are many things that Neelix. Sorry, I've still got my pad over here for my Void review, and the first thing I saw was 3 repetitions of the word Neelix equals idiot on here. That Half-Life pulls off very excellently. Now, there's a couple of things I do want to discuss about Half-Life, because this is my ruminations, and I do have to be fair, or rather, for my own sake, I have to be fair. Half-Life controlled kind of bad. The mere fact that they had platforming puzzle sections, I kind of get where they were going, and especially since that was kind of big at the time, but I described it to a friend of mine who burst into hysterics. I can't actually use that description now. But basically, you're on a couple of skis which have been greased and buttered at the same time, and you're sliding around a marble pit. That's Half-Life. It's like, the controls were not the greatest things in the world for that kind of platforming puzzling. It was great for shooting, great for the intense action, because you do feel very fast. You're basically running quite fast when you really think about it, and you can have a great deal of speed and adrenaline within your motion, or you can be nice and cautious. And indeed, if I might be honest, this I think was unintentional, but the fact that you have that, you pap forward and you go forward for an inch, but then you slide for a bit to do this in slow motion here, is an excellent way to add tension when you're trying to be cautious, when you're trying to inch your way forward, because you basically can't. You're like, inch, whoa, I do have to give them props for the fact that they actually managed to make real AI for several of the enemies. Not all the enemies. They didn't just make a new AI and stamp it on everything. They used it strategically in places that it made sense, and not only did it add to the challenge, it added to the atmosphere, it added to the environment, it added to the overall feeling of the game. Very well done on that part. Um, One of the other things I do like about Half-Life is at a certain for a very large portion of the game, bullets are a valuable resource and something you use only when either when you have to or when you're sure you need it, that kind of a thing, right? I actually rather enjoyed that. Of course, I tend to like that scavenging survivalist type gameplay, as I mentioned way back in my Fallout 3 review. But the point remains, I do think that was a good touch. Obviously, at a certain point, that no longer is a concern, but point remaining. Now, a lot has been said about the last stages of the game. Um, the whole Zen jumping puzzle thing. I have to be completely honest, I hated those jumping puzzles, and I know I'm not alone in that. I know I'm not. And I have to put that in the negative category. I have to, because it was just so frustrating, irritating, and it didn't have to be, if you understand what I mean. It doesn't actually further the service of the story. And I say that knowing that so much of the Zen levels did. So much of that area one of the things I've talked about as well, in addition to subtlety, is showing rather than telling. Rather than having someone walk up and say, "This is what happened here," or having a journal entry or whatever, you see things, you see results, you see side effects of what's going on there, and so you can tell through being shown rather than told what exactly is going on in Zen and what and the levels of complexity they're in and the politics that are involved and all that fun stuff, right? You know, it was very interesting, it was very engaging. That was all in service of the story. Several of the other puzzles you go through in the place are in service of the story. The jumping puzzles, no. I'm sorry, but no. You could have accomplished the same thing much easier if you really wanted to. And but I'm going to go ahead and segue this into a positive because I want to talk about the build-up. Okay, I've talked about pacing. This builds into that. Okay, whatever you think, I have to posit the fact that the pacing through Zen up to the finale was perfect. One of the things I've talked about is the concept of the build up, the finale, the final boss, and then the ending, okay? All of these are part of one coherent unit when you look at it from a literary perspective, okay? And in my mind, admittedly, I tend to think of Final Fantasy IV as the perfect way of doing that. I shouldn't say perfect; it's not the best, but it's the textbook. Okay, and I'm not saying that's bad either. Quite the contrary. I love the whole sequence, the final sequence of Final Fantasy IV, but I think that's basically the textbook way to do what I call the epic awesome thing. And I know that's not the most specific term in the world, but I call it that specifically because the whole point is to be a build-up to a massive, epic, this is the fate of the world battle, and you're trying your best, you know, that kind of thing, right? Because that's what the final battle promised on, and indeed fulfilled. Zeramus was one of my favorite final bosses of all time. But I have posited before, I've stated before that you don't have to do that. You don't have to go for the epic awesome. And I was challenged recently to name at least one example of another game that did an extremely well done, extremely awesome last boss, build up finale, last boss, and ending sequence, which didn't do this, if you follow me, just the build up, and then boom, there's the last boss up here, and then there's the ending, right? And the endings usually in such sequences kind of keep going up. Obviously, they're not ramping up in tension or in adrenaline, but rather they ramp up because there is this jubilation about them. Again, Final Fantasy IV is a great example. The ending was very jubilant, very up-paced, very, yes, we did it. Return of the Jedi, if I might put to another example. Just in terms of the ending, obviously, not the rest of the construct, but the ending was very whoa. Um, so she posted to me, okay, try and come up with examples that aren't like that, that are still excellent, and I came up with two. I probably could come up with more off the top of my head if I really thought about it, but two immediately come to mind, and I almost feel cheap because these two games are widely recognized as extremely artistic and critically acclaimed. That would be Earthbound and Half-Life. Half-Life does something. Earthbound does this to an extent, but and both of them kind of follow the same pathway. But again, going with this thing here and the relative energy levels and whatnot, Half-Life does quite a bit of a build-up over to here until you get to Zen. And then everything in Zen is this slow decline, and it is slow, and that's important. Everything slowly gets quieter. Slowly, 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 until you get down here, and it stops getting quiet. It starts getting creepy at a certain point. At a certain point, it's no longer just peaceful or calm. It's getting to the point where you're starting to get genuine tension. You, the player, are starting to feel tension because nothing's happened in so long. Beautifully done, I might add. And yes, there's the two boss fights in the middle of that. I don't really count those. Those are spikes at best. So it's doing this slow decline, and then it gets, let's push the scale this way a bit. We get to the part right before, there's a room right before you fight Nylunth, where it's like this, and then that room just kind of plummets. And then the last boss is way down here, very quiet, no music at all. There's this echoing sound effect. He is saying things that are terrifying and creepy and have long-term potential that we end up finding out about in Half-Life 2. There's so much exposition. There's so much done in that scene. That it is such a beautifully done final boss because while it is challenging to an extent, there is nothing epic in the sense of "Whoa, yeah, final boss," and there's nothing impacting. There's nothing dramatic. It's just so quietly dead, and it's done so beautifully. You are fighting that last boss. You don't you only have the barest idea of what this thing is or why. You only have the barest idea of what's going on. It is talking to you in this horrifying, degrading tone as you're listening. Not that it's being degradous of you, but its own tone is degrading. And the imagery of the room and the way they presented its attacks and the way they presented it itself and the way it looks at it was all just amazingly done. It really was. If you haven't experienced it, please go out, do yourself a favor, and buy Half-Life right now and go play it. I mean that sincerely. I genuinely mean that sincerely. I have a friend who cannot stand first-person shooters, and I have told him, play Half-Life, because, oh my god. And so this whole last boss really is just a microcosm of the entire game as a whole, because one other thing that I wanted to talk about, this is related to everything I've talked about, the showing and not telling and whatnot. One of the important aspects of showing and not telling, and I've talked about this before with regards to some of the early Final Fantasies as well, is when you present just say the outline of something, of an idea or a concept or whatever, when you give just enough hints of something that's going on without actually stating it outright, it's human nature to try and fill in those pieces, sometimes without even thinking about it. I've had people come to me, and we were discussing something. This wasn't in regard to Half-Life, it was another game, but exact same concept. And I was talking about, blah, 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 blah. And I mentioned something along the lines of, they finally confirmed, da 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 da. And the guy looked at me and was like, well, I thought that was true all along. And I was like, well, no, if you actually look back at the game, they never say anything. They never actually put that. And he was so surprised because I was right. They never said it. They never actually stated it outright. It was just he automatically, because he's human and it's human nature, assumed based on the outline, based on the puzzle pieces that were and weren't there. It's that negative space concept again that comes back to art and it comes back to creative design. You show a picture by not showing it, right? The whole Nihilith battle is a beautiful example of that. All of Half-Life is really, but especially the Nihilith battle. Just by looking at it, there's a conscious choice that goes into art design when it comes to what the enemies look like. You don't just do that by accident unless you're a really crummy game developer, and this is Valve we're talking about. And so they went rather starkly and specifically out of their way to make Nihilith look the way he did, so you would assume things naturally or automatically. And at the very least, it would engage you in thinking about it. They made the way he talks and the way he says things cryptically on purpose to make you automatically assume or think about it. The whole presentation, all of it, including the lack of music and the general quiet atmosphere thereof, the very creepy, quiet, oh my god atmosphere, was designed on purpose specifically to make the player go, okay, and fill in the blanks themselves. And that's one of the true powers of a really well done video game in general, and first person storytelling tends to do that very well, especially at least when it's done properly, in my opinion. I'm actually getting dried out here. I'm sorry, this is Half-Life. What do you want? I'm enthusiastic. They so the whole has, and the beautiful thing is, I was talking. Okay, let's get back to this original topic. The pacing goes down here, and Nihilith is way down here in the depths of creepiness and deadness and abysmal and depression and all that stuff. And then it gets to the ending, and this is the beautiful part. The ending actually manages to go down another notch. Rather than having the jubilant, they could have done this. They could have shown, the world is saved and we've done all this. They had this design choice. Instead, they have a quiet tram ride as they don't get the tram immediately. They have this quiet series of cutscenes as you see bits and pieces of things, and he talks about things that aren't even fully elaborated on, the border world, and now that we've been able to move in here, and blah blah blah, and then it ends on the tram, and he's like, time to choose. and then you choose, and no matter which you pick, this stays down here. That's the hilarious part. No matter which one you choose, the pace still stays down right here, and then it just kind of stops. Beautiful, brilliantly done, absolutely amazing. Now, one of the things I have heard said before, Yahtzee himself mentioned this, is that it has been argued before that Half-Life is responsible for many of the bad things we got from first-person shooters, from linear storytelling, and all that sort of thing. And like him, I hate to sound like I'm aping, but again, this is stuff I was already going to say. Like him, I fervently disagree. Just because one person comes up with something good and other people try to ape that and imitate that and do it improperly does not make it the fault of the original thing, in my opinion. Obviously, I've heard this argument more than once, so obviously they're debating opinions about this and people who disagree. But when you have, if you make a perfect chocolate sundae, and someone else looks at that and says, "Aha!" and puts together a chocolate sundae with like sour cream on it because it looks the same, and some other random. I'm sorry, I can't think of anything specific. It just does it wrong. It looks the same, but when you actually start eating it, it's terrible. Do you then blame the person who made the chocolate sundae? Or do you blame the person who decided that maybe we can cynically and indeed stupidly try and assume that we can get the same results out of trying to look the same without actually bothering to deal with any of the core gameplay elements, if you understand where I'm going with this. So it is my opinion that Valve and Half-Life and that team gets full kudos and full props for making one of the truly greatest games of all time to date, Half-Life 1, and I genuinely recommend anyone out there who has not watched it by now watches it. I know this is somewhat of a short review, and I do apologize for that, but this is Half-Life, and everything I'm kind of skipping here has to do with either subtleties that I didn't want to go into detail. I try not to go into detail too many of subtleties, because if I did, my videos would be even longer, believe it or not. Someone recently posted on the forums a in-depth analysis of several of the characters of Final Fantasy XII, which I agree with completely, and was thinking about discussing with that game. But again, if I go into detail on everything, these videos are going to be so much longer. I have to cut myself out at a certain point. Similarly, most of the other things I could say are things you've already heard. If Again, it's like telling the internet that Half-Life is good. It's just kind of like, duh, you know. Most people already know this fact. So I just wanted to cover the things that I felt hadn't really been discussed in great depth, or the things that were very important to me with regards there too. So I do apologize. But make no mistake, the length of my review does not determine the quality. Half-Life is an amazing, incredible game, and I do recommend it.